The river ran like molten iron. Sunlight caught the ripples, turning the Seine into a ribbon of fire streaked with blood. On the banks, the bodies of Frankish knights floated face down, their polished armour dulled by mud and gore. Across a narrow wooden bridge barely wide enough for a cart stood 40 figures, calm, deliberate, and deadly. They were Vikings. Their axes glinted in the dying light, their shields raised in perfect formation, their eyes unyielding. Behind them, the river carried away the broken, the terrified, and the dead. France's pride, an army of thousands, had faltered. Its finest knights had charged, swords raised, banners snapping in the wind. But the bridge had become a trap, a bottleneck that turned strength into vulnerability. One by one, men fell into the cold, swirling current. Horses panicked, slipping and drowning, dragging their riders down in a tangle of panic and steel. And the 40 on the bridge laughed, their voices cutting through the chaos like iron. This was Pont-de-l'Arche, November 1885. Half of the French army would die here, not from overwhelming numbers but from strategy, skill and terror. At the heart of it all was Béon Ironside, a giant among warriors, and the Raven, a berserker whose fury had no master but death itself. 40 men against thousands, and yet the outcome was never in doubt. By sunset, the Seine would claim more victims than any sword could. For those who survived, the stories would travel faster than the river's current. The Vikings could not be killed, their axes cursed by gods, their battle cries harbingers of doom. The bridge at Pont-de-l'Arche was more than timber and nails, it was the fulcrum of an empire's fate. Control it, and you controlled the flow of armies, of supplies, of hope. And the Vikings held it, calm, ruthless, unbroken. As dawn broke over the Seine, the empire had already begun to crumble. From the north, longships sliced through the grey waters toward Paris, each vessel carrying warriors whose names were whispered in fear, men who lived for the clash of steel, the roar of axes and the chaos of battle. Inside the city walls, panic and preparation intertwined. Farmers, merchants and soldiers hauled stones, filled trenches and sharpened swords. Bells rang through the narrow streets, calling citizens to arms. Every tower and gate became a lookout, every citizen a potential defender. The sense of impending doom pressed down on the cobblestones of Paris. Outside, the Vikings encamped along the riverbanks, their numbers vast, their formations disciplined yet unpredictable. Archers took positions along the shoreline while berserkers prowled, their war cries echoing over the water like distant thunder. This was not merely a raid, it was a calculated siege, a hammer poised to crush the city and bend it to the Northman's will. The Seine, once a lifeline, had become a battleground. Longboats bristled with warriors ready to strike, carrying the promise of death across every ripple. Paris would face the full fury of the Vikings' wrath. Its walls would be tested, its gates assailed, and its people forced to confront fear in its purest, most tangible form. And yet, amid the tension, a spark of resolve flared within the defenders, for they knew the survival of the city, the soul of a kingdom, rested in their hands. The siege was coming. The air itself seemed to tremble with it. Paris had never faced anything like this, and the coming days would etch themselves into history in fire, blood, and unyielding courage. The storm sweeping toward Paris had no intention of slowing, and neither did the Viking fleet. As their longships pressed deeper into the Seine, one obstacle, just one, stood between them and the undefended heart of West Francia, a narrow strip of stone and timber spanning the river at Pont-de-l'Arche, suddenly the hinge upon which the kingdom's survival would turn. The waters beneath carried more than currents now. They carried the smell of ash from villages already burning upriver, and the rhythmic pulse of hundreds of oars cutting through the flood. No fortress walls, no army in formation, just this bridge, a simple crossing built for merchants and monks now transformed into a bulwark. Its location made it priceless. The Seine curved tightly here, squeezing the river into a confined passage. Any fleet moving toward Paris had to thread this needle. Block the bridge, and the Vikings were halted. Lose it, even for an hour, and the river became an open highway straight to the capital. West Frankish commanders understood the stakes instinctively. The men stationed at Pont-de-l'Arche reinforced the structure before dawn. Barriers rose along the planks. Chains were dragged across the water. Carpenters hammered until their hands bled. The bridge was never meant for war, but it was about to become the front line. Every scout returning from upriver carried the same chilling report. The fleet was larger than predicted, a moving forest of sails and masts blotting the horizon. This was no raid. It was an incursion designed to break the kingdom's spine. Pont-de-l'Arche had been a quiet crossing for generations. Now it had become the last narrow throat the enemy had to force open. If it held, Paris might live. If it fell, the Seine would become a road of fire straight to the city's gates. The defenders could feel the river trembling before they saw the enemy. Among the thousands of warriors, one group radiated a different kind of menace. 40 men. No more. Yet their presence eclipsed entire decks of warriors. They stood in the longship prows, stripped to the waist, smeared with ash and iron-black dyes. Their eyes didn't track the riverbanks or barricades. They stared into some invisible world just beyond ordinary perception. These were the berserkers, warriors of myth even in their own time. Frankish sources whispered of them like wolves in winter. Men who fought without shields. Men who entered battle as if welcoming death with open arms. Men who could not be called back once unleashed. Their reputation wasn't carved from victories, it was carved from terror. Before battle, they entered rituals that blurred frenzy and trance. Some bit shield rims until their mouths bled. Others pounded chests or slammed fists against foreheads, letting out guttural roars that silenced whole crews. Breathing quickened into a panting rhythm, not madness, but a deliberate descent into a violent, altered state. No armour weighed them down. Muscles glistened beneath streaks of soot and animal fat. Some wore wolf pelts, others bare hides, trophies that blurred human shape into half-beast. When light struck them, eyes caught a feverish shine that made soldiers tighten their grip on spears. Among the armada, regular warriors carried hunger for plunder. These 40 carried something far more dangerous, the belief that death was not to be feared, a certainty that the gods had chosen their hour, and violence that made the riverbank too small to contain them. Their longship angled toward the choke point as Frankish archers raised their bows. The battle was no longer just tactics or courage. It was a collision between human will and something ancient, primal, unstoppable. The full Viking armada surged into view. Steel glinted in their hands, extensions of the warriors themselves. The Dane axe, a two-handed weapon taller than a man's torso, could split shields, sever spear shafts, and cleave chainmail with terrifying efficiency. Pattern-welded swords flashed like silver lightning, designed for brutal close combat. The Franks relied on heavy cavalry, armoured riders braced for impact. But the bridge was narrow, the riverbank soft from floodwaters. A mounted charge lost its advantage. The Vikings welcomed the tight quarters. A rider could thrust, but a Viking could hook the bridle and drag both man and horse down. The clash of styles was brutal. Reach and momentum versus precision and ferocity. Steel screamed against steel as skirmishers tested the barricades. Frankish spearmen tried to hold the crossing, but Viking shields slammed into them like battering rams. Axes split spears, helmets shattered. Behind the barricades, Frankish cavalry circled, waiting for space to charge. The Vikings closed the distance, forcing combat into terrain favouring their style. The river churned with broken arrows. The bridge trembled under the weight of axes and shields. Every opening was exploited. Every step cost blood. Yet for all the Vikings' mastery, the bridge still held. Barely. The storm, however, was far from over. The berserkers had not yet entered the fight. The true collision, the one that would decide whether Pont-de-l'Arche lived or died, was only moments away. The bridge groaned beneath the weight of battle, the river turning dark with splintered shafts and shattered shields. For a moment, the defenders at Pont-de-l'Arche seemed entirely alone, cut off, pressed back, staring into the jaws of a force that refused to tire. But far behind the barricades, across muddy fields and winding roads, another sound began to cut through the wind. Hooves, hundreds of them. The arrival of Charles the Fat's army didn't come with fanfare or a heroic charge. It came like a slow-moving tide, steady, heavy, inevitable. The men at the bridge turned, hoping for reinforcements to sweep the Vikings from the Seine. What they saw was endurance, not explosive fury. Charles's host rolled into view under banners heavy with rain. Infantry trudged behind cavalry, men hardened by frontier warfare, but worn down by constant strain. Armour was functional, horses thick-necked, expressions a mixture of determination and exhaustion. These were not the shock troops of Charlemagne's golden age. They were what the fading empire still had to give. Even Charles seemed to embody the weight of the moment. He carried titles that stretched across Europe, but the Vikings respected only strength, measured not by crowns but by the steel one could bring to the field. Smoke drifted from burning farmsteads, and the horizon pulsed with the movement of the Viking fleet. The bridge itself looked less like a defensive line, and more like a wound being held shut by men on the edge of collapse. Charles ordered his men into position, heavy infantry packed behind the barricades, archers on higher ground, cavalry captains waiting for a slim opening to charge. The king's arrival didn't bring instant salvation, it brought breathing room. For the first time since dawn, the defenders began to believe they could hold the line long enough for strategy to matter. Even the Vikings noticed the shift. Their war chants faltered as the Frankish reinforcements gathered on the shore. What had been a slaughter in the making was turning into a contest worthy of legends. Charles studied the enemy with a heavy, careful gaze. His authority still mattered here. His next decisions could shape the fate of Paris. The battlefield fell into an uneasy pause. One side reinforcing fragile defences, the other preparing to unleash the full force of its elite. Charles tightened his grip on the reins. The Viking fleet tightened its formation. The bridge creaked beneath the weight of history. The moment of decisive clash was almost here, and both armies knew it. Then the silence broke. A horn bellowed from the Viking flagship, deep and guttural, rolling across the Seine like a beast waking from a long sleep. Warriors surged forward in unison, longships grinding against the current as the first wave leapt ashore. Wood thudded against mud, shields slammed into formation, axes rose high to catch the light. The Vikings advanced in a wedge designed to pierce the defenders. The berserkers remained behind, still watching. The men leading this assault were veterans, fighters who had carved their way across Europe and knew the rhythm of battle like sailors know tides. The Frankish defenders braced behind their shields, feet dug into the planks. The barricade, only wood and iron, felt like the spine of the kingdom. They locked shields edge to edge, transforming individual men into a single wall of desperate resolve. Then the two forces collided. The impact shook the bridge. Viking shields hit the Frankish wall with thunderous crack, bodies driving forward with the weight of men who believed victory was a single push away. Spears thrust outward, but attackers absorbed the blows and pressed harder. For a moment it felt like the wall might hold. Then the rhythm of the Viking assault changed. They struck with precision, driving axes into gaps, hooking edges, yanking shields to create openings. Any Frankish soldier who lifted a shield too high had his legs swept. Any attempt to reinforce a gap drew an axe through the space left behind. It was a violent chess match at arm's length. Frankish spears punched into Viking mail. Viking swords stabbed through shield rims. Helmets rang like struck bells. Every step cost blood. Neither side had breath left for shouting. Only the scrape of metal, the grunt of impact, and the river slapping against pilings below. Behind the wall, Charles's infantry pushed forward, bracing the line with raw force. Shoulder against shoulder, shield against shield, they fought not for ground but for survival measured in inches. Yet the Vikings were relentless. Their wedge tightened, pressure increasing until the wooden planks shuddered. For every man the Franks pushed back, another pressed into place. Every spear thrust met a swinging axe. The first Frankish shield splintered. 1, 2, 3. The line bent, bowing under the weight of warriors who lived for this kind of close, crushing combat. The defenders felt the bridge shrinking, space tightening, breath catching behind armoured collars. The Vikings sensed it too. Their shouts rose in feral triumph as the wall was driven backward step by step. The first clash had been a test. Now it was becoming an attempt to rip the bridge entirely open, and through all the noise, a distant, rhythmic growl began. The berserkers were stirring. Whatever happened in the first clash was only the opening note. The true storm was preparing to hit. The first clash had drained the air from the bridge. Men bled into the planks, shields hung in tatters, and the Frankish line trembled under the weight of warriors who refused to yield. But as brutal as the fighting had been, everyone sensed it. The Vikings were holding something back. Then the growl turned into a roar, rising from the central longship like the howl of a caged beast. Heads snapped toward the sound. Even seasoned Viking raiders stepped aside, widening their formation as if to make way for a force of nature. 40 berserkers burst from the ship bare-chested despite the cold, smeared in ash, blood, and streaks of red ochre. Their eyes bulged wide with a feverish glare, a gaze that saw only victims. Their breath steamed in clouds as they pounded their chests, howling curses that drowned out the river and the battle alike. Every Frankish soldier felt the shift. This was no longer warfare. This was ritualized violence, unleashed. The berserkers sprinted toward the bridge, weapons raised, muscles trembling with inhuman frenzy. They barreled past their own ranks and crashed into the front line with the momentum of a living wrecking machines. The impact was catastrophic. Frankish shields didn't crack. They exploded. Axes drove through shield and man alike. Warriors were hurled aside like children. Horses reared and panicked. Even seasoned cavalrymen could not hold formation. The animals sensed the unnatural fury pressing toward them. Charles's infantry tried to brace, but the berserkers carved through them as if they were reeds. Frankish spears shattered under their weight. Men were thrown into the river, dragged under before they could scream. The bridge, the precious choke point, had become a death trap. Still, the berserkers pushed farther. One seized a Frankish rider's spear mid-thrust, snapping it with bare hands and slamming the man onto the planks. Another climbed over the shield wall, leaping from helmet to shoulder, cutting through the rear line. The Frankish centre buckled. The flanks folded. The shield wall broke. For the first time since Charles's arrival, the defenders looked less like an army and more like a mass trying to survive the impossible. The berserkers surged forward, shrieking, axes dripping, tearing the opening wide for the full Viking host to flood through. The bridge became a wound, spilling men and splintered shields into the Seine. Yet the Vikings didn't pause. They pressed forward with cold efficiency. Behind the berserkers, the disciplined core of the Viking host, shield men with iron patience, stepped over bodies, filling gaps and sealing in the terror the berserkers had unleashed. Every Frankish retreat created new angles for slaughter. The psychology of domination mattered as much as steel. The Vikings roared with every kill, slammed axes against shields, stomped on corpses to let their enemies watch. Every soldier forced backward saw what awaited, and dread drained their strength before. Blades even touched them. Blood pooled in the grooves of the wood, bodies jammed against barricades. The smell of iron, mud, and something burnt hung like fog. Cracking bones, scraped armour, and wet impacts of axes made the bridge a theatre of pure horror. Still the Franks fought. Pockets of resistance formed around officers, using every inch to make the Vikings pay for each step. But the Vikings pressed from front and flanks simultaneously, crushing pockets from multiple directions in seconds. The bridge's defenders were ground down not by a single blow, but by relentless tightening pressure. When a berserker fell, 2 shieldmen stepped over him. When a shieldman tired, another filled the space. This was the meat grinder. Force the enemy into a confined space, break their formation, destroy their will, crush them until they ceased to be soldiers and became obstacles. It worked. The Frankish second line bent under the Viking push. Officers screamed, but their words drowned beneath fear and noise. Every retreat shrank their room to manoeuvre. Every step brought them closer to the riverbank and the chaos behind it. Charles the Fat watched with grim awareness. The army he had brought to stabilise the line was being devoured unit by unit, and worse, the Vikings had not yet fully committed their reserves. The berserkers had shattered the wall. The bridge had become a killing floor. And now the Vikings were transitioning into the next phase, tightening their grip, preparing to grind the Frankish force into complete collapse. The meat grinder was spinning faster. The Franks were running out of time, space, and hope. And the bridge was no longer a structure. It was a nightmare, an unstable strip of blood-slick timber where soldiers didn't fight so much as flail for survival. When the Frankish line finally buckled, the collapse didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a sound far more dangerous, the rising pitch of panic. It began at the centre, where men pushed back instinctively to escape the berserkers. The pressure rippled outward. Shields tilted, formations twisted. A single stumble became a chain reaction. Entire ranks folded like wet parchment, and the Frankish army transformed from a war machine into a crowd. And crowds don't think. Crowds run. Men who moments earlier stood shoulder to shoulder tripped over one another in a desperate scramble toward the riverbank. Horses reared and crashed into infantry. Spears clattered underfoot. Commanders shouted contradictory orders, but their voices disappeared under the stampede. Panic had breached the line more completely than any Viking axe. Those who tried to stand their ground found themselves crushed between fleeing comrades and the advancing wall of shields. Soldiers were knocked to the planks and trampled before they could rise. Others were shoved straight off the bridge, hitting the cold water in full armour, vanishing beneath the surface like stones. The Vikings saw the chaos and poured forward with savage precision. They didn't chase wildly. They advanced, tightening their formation, shields locked, axes ready, carving paths through the disorganised mass. Every step pushed the Franks deeper into confusion. Fear spread faster than the Vikings could swing. Attempts at reforming the lines were swallowed by the tide of terror. An entire unit suddenly sprinted for the riverbank without orders, punching a hole straight through the Frankish defence. The bridge groaned under the load, hundreds of men pushing one way, hundreds more pushing the other. Planks cracked, a support beam splintered. The structure wobbled with a sickening sway that made even hardened warriors glance down in fear. Panic didn't just weaken the Frankish army, it rewrote the battlefield. It created blind spots, broke discipline, erased leadership. Vikings exploited every angle, charging where the line sagged, slicing into gaps made by fleeing soldiers, striking at men who had lost their footing. Some Frankish officers managed to rally small groups, dragging men back into formation, but each attempt died the same death, swallowed by the tide of terror rolling across the bridge. The Franks were no longer an army, they were a mass of survivors trying to escape the nightmare pressing down on them. Above the clatter of steel and the churn of bodies came a single realization, spreading like a whispered curse. The line was gone. The plan was gone. Control was gone. Chaos had taken command. And the Vikings, masters of exploiting fear, were about to turn that chaos into a final catastrophic breakthrough. The field settled into a sickening quiet, the kind that arrives only when an army no longer exists. Frankish bodies lay twisted across the mud, armour crushed, shields split apart like broken ribs. Smoke drifted low over the ground. Somewhere beneath it, the last wounded men gasped prayers to a god who no longer held dominion over this stretch of the Seine. Out of that haze, the Vikings gathered. They moved with the slow, deliberate steps of hunters returning from a kill. Their axes, still dripping, were planted into the earth like banners of victory. The berserkers, those who survived their trance, stood in circles, heaving like exhausted beasts. Their eyes were still wide, still far away, still living inside the madness that had consumed them. Then the chanting began. It rolled through the camp like a rising tide, harsh voices praising Odin, Thor, and the spirits believed to guide their blades. Some smeared blood across their foreheads in crude symbols, others carved runes into wooden shields as offerings to the gods. For the Franks, who watched from hiding or distant tree lines, this was not a victory celebration. It was a nightmare ritual. Proof that these were not raiders of flesh and bone, but something older, darker, born from the edge of the world. Drinking horns passed from hand to hand, fires crackled. The Vikings feasted beside the very men they had cut down hours before, using fallen shields as makeshift tables. To them, this was how warriors honoured glory, by praising it openly, loudly, defiantly. The message was unmistakable. The bridge was theirs. The road to Paris was open, and no mortal force had the will to stand in their way. The Seine carried that message north, toward the walls of a city bracing for the storm. By the time word reached Paris, The news struck like a hammer blow. Scouts rode into the city soaked in rain and terror, barely able to speak. The bridge at Pont-de-l'Arche, Paris's shield, the single bottleneck that held the Vikings at bay, had been erased in one catastrophic afternoon. Now the road was open. Panic rippled through the city. Bakers, merchants, priests and nobles all understood the same thing. There were no more armies between them and the pagan host. Charles the Fat, already shaken by reports of the slaughter, convened councils that dissolved into shouting matches. Some urged evacuation, others demanded negotiation. A few begged Charles to stand and fight, but even they knew the truth. The Empire's western armies were shattered and time had run out. In the palace halls, power began to shift. Eyes turned to Odo, Count of Paris, a man younger, harder, less paralysed by fear. Soldiers rallied to him instinctively. While Charles faltered, Odo moved through the city like a spark searching for kindling, organising watch rotations, reinforcing gates, stockpiling supplies, rallying citizens who refused to abandon their homes. The fall of the bridge had done more than open a path. It had reshaped the politics of an entire kingdom. Charles' hesitation looked less like caution and more like failure. Odo's resolve felt like leadership in the making. Outside the walls, the Vikings advanced along the Seine, their longships drifting through the morning mist like spectres. Behind them came the roar of an army certain of triumph. Paris was next. Whether it lived or died would decide the fate of a dynasty, and perhaps the fate of the empire itself. Fires consumed the remnants of Frankish encampments, while the surviving Viking warriors moved among the carnage, chanting their sacred hymns to Odin and Thor. Each swing of an axe, each captured banner, became a ritual offering, a performance of power meant to terrify as much as to celebrate. Villages nearby heard the echoes of this fury, and fear became the invisible weapon that followed the Vikings wherever they roamed. Paris now stood vulnerable, a jewel stripped of its defences. Word of the Viking onslaught travelled like wildfire, igniting panic among the Frankish nobility and shaking the foundations of power. Charles the Fat faced a kingdom teetering on the brink, his indecision magnified by the ferocity of the northern invaders. In the vacuum of authority, ambitious nobles manoeuvred for position, plotting alliances and betrayals that would reshape the political landscape. The memory of this siege would linger not just in burned villages, but in the corridors of power, forcing a new generation of leaders to confront the terrifying reality. The Vikings were not a passing storm. They were a strategic force capable of dictating the fate of kings. The rivers that once carried goods and grain now ran silent. Markets, emptied by fear and flight, echoed with the absence of life and trade. Caravans halted, and Paris's surrounding countryside, stripped of supplies by fleeing peasants and Viking raids, teetered on the brink of famine. The lifeblood of the Frankish economy had been ripped away in a matter of weeks, but it was not only wealth that suffered. The Church, ever the silent observer and chronicler of chaos, saw opportunity in the devastation. Priests and bishops, speaking in solemn tones from the pulpits of ravaged cathedrals, framed the Viking assault as divine punishment, a call for penance, obedience, and spiritual renewal. Their words carried authority that secular rulers struggled to match, embedding the Church deeper into the heart of governance and public life. For the people of Francia, the shock was both material and spiritual. The terror of the Vikings had reached beyond blood and steel, shaping thought, faith, and daily survival. In the aftermath, society itself began to shift, slowly realigning around new centres of power, both earthly and divine. The land reeled, the people trembled, and the stage was set for rulers who could wield not only armies, but the unseen weight of theology. The morning air carried a deceptive calm, broken only by the distant clang of armour and the low murmur of advancing men. By sunrise, Viking longships had slipped into the Seine, disgorging waves of warriors that would soon define a nightmare across the Frankish heartland. Every movement that day mattered. Every decision weighed like iron on the fate of Paris. First came the scouts, testing the Frankish defences, probing weak points with the quiet precision of predators. Then the shields rose and the horns sounded, the Vikings' main force pressing forward with a terrifying rhythm, their axes glinting under the pale sun. The Frankish cavalry, trained and disciplined, met them with a thunderous charge, yet even their momentum faltered against the disciplined shield walls. By midday, chaos reigned. Berserkers broke through the lines with a ferocity that seemed inhuman, their screams echoing across the fields. Columns of Frankish infantry collapsed under relentless assault, leaving gaps that widened into routes. Each stage of the battle, advance, engagement, countercharge, collapse, built upon the last, creating a chain reaction of panic and slaughter. Even as evening fell, the catastrophe unfolded. Smoke and blood mingled in the haze, marking the land with every decisive blow. By reconstructing these moments step by step, the sheer scale of the disaster becomes clear. A perfectly orchestrated descent into horror, leaving Paris vulnerable and the Frankish leadership shaken to its core. As dusk settled over the blood-soaked fields, the Vikings did not rest. They moved among the fallen, chanting and singing, their voices rising like a dark hymn over the ruined landscape. Bodies were looted, valuables seized, and the spoils of war piled high, each act a calculated display of dominance. The religious aspect of their victory was no less terrifying. Temples desecrated, crosses toppled, sacred relics defiled. These were not mere acts of plunder, but psychological weapons aimed to shatter morale. To the people of Paris, the invaders were more than men. They were wrath incarnate, unstoppable forces with the divine mandate, leaving survivors trembling under the weight of fear. Paris now stood vulnerable, a jewel stripped bare by its failure to repel the northern storm. Political power shifted like sand, as nobles questioned leadership and loyalty fractured under the strain of incompetence and fear. The absence of strong, immediate defence had cascading effects. Trade routes were disrupted, supply chains faltered, and neighbouring regions reeled at the example. Leadership changes loomed inevitable, heralding a new order forged in the fire of disaster. What had begun as a single raid now threatened to redraw the map of power in the Frankish kingdom, leaving rulers scrambling to respond before the next wave of destruction arrived.